How long have you been with us, Amanda? Jackson Maxwell leaned back in his leather chair, voice eerily casual. 29 years, is it? 29 years and 362 days to be exact. I replied, my stomach nodding as I noticed the manila folder on his desk. In all my years at Westfield Manufacturing, I'd never been called into an executive's office on a Friday afternoon. Something was wrong. I'm Amanda Collins, 61 years old, and until 5 minutes ago, I was the senior compliance officer at one of Chicago's largest manufacturing enterprises. I've spent nearly 3 decades ensuring that Westfield operated within legal parameters, documenting irregularities, and maintaining standards when others sought convenient solutions to complex regulatory challenges. My pension was set to fully vest on Monday, just 3 days away. The milestone I'd worked my entire adult life for was within reach. Jackson slid the folder across his polished desk. Due to financial restructuring, we're terminating your position effective immediately. His eyes never met mine. This is your severance package. Sign by tomorrow or forfeit everything. HR will escort you to clear your desk. The room tilted slightly. Financial restructuring? Westfield had announced record profits last quarter. I should have felt anger, shock, perhaps even an urge to plead. Instead, a strange calm washed over me. This wasn't random. This was calculated, precisely timed to fall before my pension vested. Thank you for the opportunity, I said quietly, picking up the folder without opening it. Jackson appeared surprised by my composure, perhaps expecting tears or protests. But I'd spent my career examining patterns, and this one was transparent. I stood, smoothed my skirt, and exited with my dignity intact. Rebecca from Human Resources hovered awkwardly as I packed my personal items. The photograph of my late husband Daniel, the plant my daughter had given me when she left for college 15 years ago, and the plaque commemorating my 25 years of service. I didn't take much. Most of what truly mattered couldn't fit in a cardboard box. Rebecca whispered apologies, glancing nervously toward the security guard waiting to escort me out. This isn't right. I simply replied that it was what it was, but inside I knew better. This wasn't just wrong, it was potentially illegal. For the past 4 years, I'd been meticulously documenting financial irregularities that had accelerated since Jackson joined the company. I'd sent detailed memos up the chain, flagged suspicious patterns, and presented evidence of backdated reports. All of it had been dismissed, buried, or returned with instructions to focus on more pressing matters. The security guard held the door uncomfortably as I walked through the lobby one final time. I nodded politely when he wished me a good weekend. I fully intended to have one. The drive home felt surreal. 29 years of dedication ended with a manila folder and a cardboard box. The April rain tapped against my windshield as I navigated the familiar streets of Chicago, past the church where Daniel and I had married, beyond the school where our daughter had graduated, toward the modest home I'd maintained alone since becoming a widow 12 years ago. I reflected on the sacrifices I'd made for Westfield. The missed recitals during those early years working late to earn promotions, family vacations cut short when compliance emergencies arose, countless evenings reviewing documentation that nobody else had patience to examine. I'd given the company my prime years, believing in the security my pension would eventually provide. When I pulled into my driveway, I sat quietly for a moment, allowing myself to feel the weight of what had happened. Jackson Maxwell had joined Westfield just 6 months prior, arriving with a reputation for optimizing operations, a euphemism for cutting corners regardless of consequences. I knew we would eventually clash when I refused to certify compliance on his latest initiative, a measure that violated several regulatory requirements. What I hadn't anticipated was how swiftly and mercilessly he would act to eliminate me. Inside, I made tea and sat at my kitchen table, finally opening the severance package. The terms were insulting: 3 months' salary in exchange for waiving all rights to future claims against the company. No pension, no healthcare continuation, no acknowledgement of nearly 3 decades of service. Just a check and a legal trap designed to silence me. The document required my signature by 5 p.m. tomorrow. They were counting on fear and desperation to make me sign quickly without seeking advice. This wasn't standard procedure. It was a calculated effort to rob me of everything I'd earned. I set the papers aside and walked to my home office where I kept my personal records. Behind family photo albums sat a fireproof lockbox, my insurance policy. For 4 years, I'd been bringing home copies of troubling financial documents, keeping detailed notes of conversations, and saving emails that outlined patterns of misconduct. Not because I planned to use them, but because my professional instincts told me something wasn't right. I opened the box and reviewed its contents. Loan applications with falsified data, quarterly reports with manipulated figures, emails instructing staff to backdate quality control certifications. It was all there, over 1,000 pages of evidence showing systematic fraud that had accelerated under Jackson's direction. I'd reported every issue through proper channels, only to be ignored or sidelined. I reached for my phone, scrolling to a contact I hadn't called in years. Michael Rivera had been Westfield's chief financial officer before leaving to work for the Securities and Exchange Commission. He'd always respected my diligence, even when others found it tedious. It's time, I thought as my finger hovered over his name. The next morning, I woke with purpose. After speaking with Michael for nearly 2 hours the previous evening, I had a clear path forward. I dressed carefully in the Navy suit I reserved for important meetings, as if preparing for battle. In a way, I was. Michael had listened intently as I outlined the situation and described the documentation I'd collected. His response was measured but resolute. This isn't just wrongful termination, Amanda. Based on what you're describing, Westfield could be facing serious securities violations. The timing with your pension, that's just the tip of the iceberg. He explained the whistleblower protections available through the SEC and arranged for me to meet with his team on Monday morning. Don't sign anything, he cautioned, and secure those documents somewhere safe. I spent Saturday morning making copies of everything, organizing the evidence chronologically, and preparing a detailed index. The work kept my mind focused, preventing the anger and hurt from overwhelming me. By noon, I had 3 identical packages ready, one for the SEC, one for my personal records, and one that would serve as leverage if needed. My phone rang several times throughout the day, Rebecca from HR, Jackson Maxwell, even the company's general counsel. I let each call go to voicemail, listening to their increasingly urgent messages. Their desperation confirmed what I already suspected. They knew they were vulnerable and wanted my silence secured before the weekend ended. At 4:30 p.m., my doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I could see Jackson standing on my porch, his expensive suit looking out of place in my modest neighborhood. I didn't answer. I watched silently as he eventually placed an envelope in my mailbox and returned to his luxury sedan. Only then did I retrieve it, another copy of the same agreement with a handwritten note, final opportunity, signed by 9 a.m. Monday. That evening, my daughter called for our weekly chat. Catherine was concerned by the strange tone in my voice. I considered downplaying the situation but decided against it. Catherine deserved the truth. I told her simply that I'd been terminated, just days away from my pension vesting. She offered to fly home from Boston immediately, but I assured her I had matters under control. After we hung up, I sat in my living room as darkness fell, thinking about Monday's meeting with the SEC. For years, I tried to address these issues internally, believing in the system and the company's integrity. I'd been loyal, discreet, and professional, even when I suspected serious wrongdoing. But Westfield had made its choice, and now I would make mine. I would not be signing their agreement. I would not be silenced. And most importantly, I would not let them discard 3 decades of my life without consequence. Monday couldn't come soon enough. Monday morning arrived with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. I dressed carefully, placed my documentation in a secure briefcase, and drove downtown to the federal building where Michael had arranged our meeting. The weight of what I was about to do sat heavily on my shoulders, but there was also a sense of rightness to it all. The SEC offices were understated but imposing, all glass partitions and hushed conversations. Michael met me in the lobby, his familiar face lined with more years, but still carrying the sharp intelligence I remembered. He led me to a conference room where 2 other investigators waited. Sophia Martinez, a senior enforcement attorney, and Robert Shun, a forensic accountant. Both greeted me with professional courtesy. Sophia confirmed that I understood the process we were initiating. Once I shared this information, an investigation would become official with no turning back. I assured her I comprehended completely. For the next 3 hours, I walked them through my documentation, the irregular financial reporting I'd first noticed 4 years ago when shipments didn't match invoices, the quality control certifications that had been backdated after products had already been shipped, the pattern of revenue manipulation that had intensified in recent quarters, particularly after Jackson Maxwell's arrival. Robert examined the financial documents with growing concern, noting that the discrepancies weren't small. The company had been systematically overstating revenues by at least 18% for the past 2 years. That constituted securities fraud. Sophia asked if I'd reported these issues internally. I confirmed multiple times, showing them copies of my memos and emails. Each time I'd been told the issues were being addressed or that I was misinterpreting the data. When Jackson joined 6 months ago, my concerns started being rerouted to his office, where they disappeared entirely. Michael leaned forward, asking if I believed my termination was directly related to these reports. Without question, I explained. The timing, 3 days before my pension vested, made it obvious. But more than that, I had recently flagged several major issues with Jackson's latest cost-cutting initiative. He needed me gone before I could escalate further. As our meeting concluded, Sophia outlined the next steps. They would need my formal statement, then begin their investigation, which typically remained confidential until they determined whether enforcement action was warranted. When I asked how long that might take, she replied that it varied, but given the documentation I'd provided and the clear pattern of misconduct, they might move quickly. I hadn't even returned home when my phone rang. It was Rebecca from HR, her voice trembling. Something was happening. The board had called an emergency meeting. Jackson had been locked in his office all morning, and there were rumors about SEC investigators contacting their general counsel. So it had begun, faster than I'd anticipated. The SEC must have made immediate contact with Westfield's legal team. I wasn't surprised. Rebecca hesitantly asked if I'd reported something. I simply replied that I'd done what I should have done years ago. When I inquired about my pension paperwork, she informed me that the executive committee was reviewing my termination. They'd put everything on hold until further notice. An hour later, my phone rang again. This time, it was Edward Harrington, the chairman of the board, a man who had barely acknowledged my existence during our few previous interactions. His typically confident voice sounded strained as he asked if I would be willing to come to the office tomorrow to discuss matters. I declined, explaining that any discussions should include my attorney and potentially representatives from the Securities and Exchange Commission. The silence on the other end was profound. Finally, he cleared his throat and suggested perhaps we could arrange something more formal. As I hung up, I felt no satisfaction, only a deep weariness at the necessity of it all. I had never wanted to be a whistleblower. I had only wanted to do my job with integrity and retire with the security I'd earned. But Westfield had forced my hand, and now we would all face the consequences. My phone continued to ring throughout the evening, colleagues seeking information, executives attempting damage control. I answered none of them. The time for private conversations had passed. Now everything would happen in the light. By Wednesday morning, the storm had fully broken. Local business publications ran headlines about an SEC investigation into Westfield Manufacturing, sending the company's stock into a tailspin. Financial analysts who had praised Jackson's efficiency measures just weeks earlier now questioned the integrity of the company's entire reporting structure. I received a formal letter from Westfield's legal department withdrawing my termination notice and placing me on administrative leave with full benefits pending an internal review. It was a transparent attempt to mitigate damages, coming far too late. At 10 a.m., my attorney Victoria Palmer accompanied me to a meeting at Westfield's headquarters. The same security guard who had escorted me out on Friday now nodded respectfully as we entered. The atmosphere in the building was tense, with employees huddled in whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when we passed. We were shown to the main boardroom, where Edward Harrington waited with the company's outside counsel and 3 other board members. Jackson Maxwell was conspicuously absent. Edward began by thanking me for coming, seeming to have aged years in just days. He explained they'd initiated a comprehensive internal investigation into the concerns I'd raised. Victoria spoke before I could respond, making it clear that I hadn't suddenly raised these concerns after my termination. I had documented and reported them repeatedly over 4 years as my job required. The company's decision to ignore those reports and then terminate me days before my pension vested spoke volumes. Edward shifted uncomfortably, assuring me that my termination had been rescinded and that I was considered an employee in good standing with all benefits intact. When I directly asked about my pension, he quickly confirmed it was secure. He even offered me a consulting role after retirement, claiming they valued my expertise. Victoria interrupted, stating that I wouldn't be making any decisions that day and that any discussion about future arrangements should be preceded by a full accounting of how my previous concerns were suppressed. The meeting continued for another hour, with the board members attempting to distance themselves from both Jackson's actions and the financial irregularities I documented. They painted themselves as victims of misinformation, expressing shock and disappointment at the apparent misconduct. I remained mostly silent, letting Victoria handle the legal maneuvering while I observed their body language. These were people I'd worked alongside for years, yet they'd never truly noticed me. Now they couldn't look away, their expressions a mix of fear and newfound respect. As we prepared to leave, Edward made one final appeal, hoping I might consider speaking with the SEC investigators about the corrective actions they were taking. I looked at him directly for the first time. "Mr. Harrington, I've spent 29 years dedicated to this company's compliance. During that time, I filed 43 major reports documenting serious irregularities. I sent 14 memos specifically addressing the issues now under investigation. I requested 8 meetings with executive leadership to discuss these concerns, of which only 2 were granted, and neither resulted in action. At what point in that history did I have your support?" The room fell silent. I continued, explaining that I would cooperate fully with both the internal investigation and the SEC, but I would be speaking only to the facts, as I always had. Whether those facts supported or damaged Westfield would depend entirely on what they did next, not what they said in this room. As Victoria and I walked out, she whispered that my statement had been perfectly expressed. It wasn't until we reached the parking lot that I allowed myself a deep breath. The adrenaline that had carried me through the confrontation began to fade, leaving me drained but clear-headed. This wasn't victory, not yet. It was merely the beginning of accountability. When I asked Victoria what happened next, she smiled slightly. "Now they scramble to save what they can while the investigation continues. But make no mistake, Amanda, they're terrified of you." I shook my head. "They're not terrified of me. They're terrified of the truth. There's a difference." Victoria nodded thoughtfully. "There is indeed. And that difference is why you'll win this, regardless of how it plays out." As I drove home, I wondered what Daniel would have thought of all this. My late husband had always encouraged my meticulous nature, even when others found it frustrating. "Your attention to detail isn't a quirk, Amanda," he'd say. "It's a superpower." Perhaps he'd been right all along. By Friday, exactly 1 week after my termination, the story had evolved into a full-blown corporate scandal. The SEC had issued formal requests for information from Westfield, and an internal memo from Edward Harrington announced Jackson Maxwell's immediate suspension pending investigation. The company's stock had dropped nearly 30%, triggering concerns from major investors and partners. I was no longer just Amanda Collins, overlooked compliance officer. Business journals now referred to me as a whistleblower and the woman who exposed Westfield. The sudden attention was uncomfortable, but I remained focused on the process, working closely with the SEC investigators who now had offices set up in a separate building near Westfield's headquarters. The evidence I'd provided had opened many doors, but the investigation was revealing even more troubling patterns. Michael called to update me on their progress. "Amanda, it's worse than we thought," he said gravely. "The financial manipulation goes back at least 5 years, predating Maxwell. He accelerated it, but he didn't start it. I suspected as much. There were irregularities I couldn't fully document because I couldn't access certain executive-level reports. Michael explained that they could access them now, and they told a story of systematic fraud designed to inflate the company's value. The board was claiming ignorance, but at least 3 members had to have known. They had signed off on key transactions. This news should have vindicated me, but instead it left me feeling hollow. The company I'd dedicated my life to had been corrupted at levels even I hadn't fully comprehended. The people I'd trusted with my concerns had been actively participating in the very fraud I was reporting. That afternoon, I received a call from Catherine. Her voice was tight with anger as she asked if I'd seen the news. They were trying to discredit me. Jackson had given an interview claiming I had performance issues and was bitter about being passed over for promotion. He was making it sound like I was retaliating because of personal grievances. I wasn't surprised. It was a predictable defense strategy. Attack the whistleblower's credibility rather than address the allegations. I assured Catherine it didn't matter. The evidence spoke for itself. My performance reviews had been exemplary for 29 years. They couldn't rewrite that history. But Jackson was trying to do exactly that. By that evening, several news outlets had picked up his narrative, questioning my motives and suggesting I had manipulated documentation to frame him. It was a desperate move from a desperate man, but it still stung to see my integrity questioned so publicly. Victoria called immediately, advising me not to respond to any of it. The SEC would issue a statement tomorrow clarifying my whistleblower status and the credibility of my evidence. She urged me to let the official channels handle this. I told her I wasn't planning to respond, but I was going to do something else. The next morning, I drove to my local bank and asked to speak with the manager, Diane Fitzgerald. I'd known her for years, as she handled most of Westfield's local banking transactions. Inside the private vault room, I opened my safe deposit box and removed a sealed envelope I'd placed there 3 years ago. It contained copies of email exchanges between Jackson's predecessor and 2 board members discussing ways to manage financial appearances during a critical acquisition period. I had found these accidentally while archiving old emails, and something had told me to secure them separately from my other documentation. I hadn't included these in my initial SEC report because they weren't directly related to the current issues. But now, with Jackson attempting to undermine my credibility, they provided crucial context, showing that the problematic practices predated my concerns about him specifically. I called Michael immediately. "I have something you need to see," I told him. "It changes the narrative completely." As I drove to meet him, I felt no satisfaction, only certainty that the full truth would now emerge, regardless of who it implicated. The emergency board meeting was called for Monday morning, 10 days after my termination and 7 days after the SEC investigation became public. I wasn't invited, but I didn't need to be there to know what was happening. The additional documentation I provided had accelerated the investigation dramatically, implicating not just Jackson, but multiple board members in a years-long pattern of financial manipulation. Michael called me from outside the meeting room. "It's chaos in there," he reported. "The SEC enforcement team just presented their preliminary findings. 3 board members have resigned on the spot. Jackson is trying to claim he was just following established practices, but no one's buying it anymore." By noon, Westfield issued a press release announcing a leadership restructuring and full cooperation with regulatory authorities. The carefully worded statement confirmed the resignation of 4 board members, including Edward Harrington, and the termination of Jackson Maxwell for cause. The company's stock, already battered, dropped another 12%. That afternoon, my phone rang. It was Rebecca from HR again, informing me that the interim CEO wanted to meet with me tomorrow if possible. The interim CEO was Vanessa Donaldson, the former chief operating officer who had always treated me with professional respect, if not warmth. I agreed to the meeting, but insisted it take place at my attorney's office. When Vanessa arrived the next day, she looked exhausted but determined. She began without pleasantries, acknowledging that the company was in crisis and that I was at the center of it, not because I'd done anything wrong, but because I was the only one who had consistently done what was right. She slid a folder across the table, eerily similar to the termination paperwork Jackson had presented just 11 days earlier. This one officially rescinded my termination, reinstated my employment retroactively, and confirmed my full pension vesting. It also included an additional compensation package recognizing the difficulties I'd experienced. I opened the folder. The compensation package included a sum equal to 5 years of my salary, full healthcare coverage for life, and a formal apology from the board. Vanessa explained they were also establishing a new corporate ethics division and would like me to help design it as a consultant after my retirement. I closed the folder without commenting on the offer and asked about Jackson Maxwell and the board members involved. Vanessa's expression hardened as she informed me criminal charges were expected and the company would not be defending them. Justice, it seemed, had finally arrived at Westfield Manufacturing. 6 months later, I sat in a federal courtroom watching as Jackson Maxwell and two former board members entered guilty pleas to securities fraud charges. The man who had so casually ended my career now looked diminished in his dark suit, his arrogance replaced by defeat. Our eyes met briefly as he turned to leave, and I saw recognition there, not of me specifically, but of what I represented, the consequences of his actions personified. The Westfield scandal had become a case study in corporate governance failures and the crucial role of internal compliance. I had declined the consulting position with the reorganized company, choosing instead to work with regulatory agencies to develop better whistleblower protocols. My story had inspired other compliance officers to come forward with their own documentation of corporate wrongdoing, creating a ripple effect across industries. The SEC had awarded me a substantial whistleblower payment, 15% of the penalties assessed against Westfield. Combined with my pension and the settlement, I had more financial security than I'd ever imagined possible. I'd established a scholarship fund for women pursuing careers in corporate ethics and compliance, naming it after Daniel. Catherine had relocated to Chicago to be closer to me, bringing my two grandchildren with her. We spent weekends together at my new lakeside home, building memories I'd missed while working all those long hours. One evening, as we sat watching the sunset over the water, Catherine asked a question that caught me off guard. "Mom, do you regret staying at Westfield all those years, given how it ended?" I considered this carefully. "No," I finally answered. "I regret that it was necessary to expose them, but I don't regret my work there." Integrity isn't just about being honest when it's easy. It's about maintaining your principles even when, especially when, it costs you something. Catherine nodded thoughtfully. "You taught me that, not with words, but by example." That, I realized, was perhaps the most meaningful outcome of all, not the vindication, not the financial security, but the knowledge that my choices had shown my daughter what it meant to stand firm in your values, regardless of the consequences. As for Westfield Manufacturing, the company had survived, though greatly diminished. The new leadership had implemented stringent compliance protocols and transparent reporting practices. They still sent me their annual reports, perhaps as a reminder, perhaps as an apology. I read them carefully, noting the improved practices with professional satisfaction. Some might see my story as one of revenge, but I've never viewed it that way. I simply did what I had always done, documented the facts, reported the truth, and stood by my findings. The difference is that this time, finally, others were forced to listen.